Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, October the 13th, and if I were Keir Starmer, I too would have flown to Egypt to hang with the Donald to avoid the mess his government got itself into over China. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. The future of Gaza and the Middle East will be discussed in Sharm el-Sheikh. Meanwhile, the UK's attitudes to China will be unpicked in the Commons this afternoon after the row over the collapse of the Chinese spy trial has led to a frenzy at Westminster. Camille Badenoch's now got involved. She's written to the Prime Minister. And she's not the only voice putting pressure on Number 10 to explain what really happened in the British deep state.
Last night, Keir Starmer landed in the resort of Sharm to meet the hosts, Presidents Trump and El-Sisi of Egypt, along with the leaders of Turkey, Jordan, Germany, France, Italy, the UN and the EU.
But let's note that the two primary parties to the conflict, Israel and Hamas, are not there, and nor is the main backer of Hamas, Iran. It's dubbed the Summit for Peace, and it comes on the same day that Hamas is to release its 20 remaining living Israeli hostages. The eyes of the world are going to be trained on that. If it goes to plan, I suspect it will be remembered for time to come for those images on the Israeli border rather than the image of the summit across in Egypt.
I did ask someone last night at the top of government, why is Keir Starmer going? Was it for talks? Was it just because he wanted to be part of the moment? And the candid reply came back, he's going because everyone is there. And I think there's no escaping that. That's our main story, and we'll go into that in some depth in a moment. And by the way, keep an eye on Sky. Mark Stone is there alongside our Beth Rigby. And Sharm is a holiday resort, right, Anne? And even our correspondents have to stay in hotels and do lives from hotels. And if you watch Mark Stone last night, quite evidently there is a man heading either to or from the swimming pool, whichever. There was just a lot of flesh on screen in the background. So if that's your thing, stay tuned to Sky.
I've actually covered summits in Sharm and I know exactly what you mean. Just someone's going for the breakfast buffet just as you get to your most important policy takeaway line. We'll also dive in, it wasn't me. We'll also dive into the burgeoning China row. I think it's reached the point when there is so much shouting that it's good to unpick the basics of what's going on here. And we've also got some interesting background briefings from various corners on what's happening there. First, a few Westminster things to mention though, Sam.
Yeah, just a couple of straws in the wind before we get down to the main business. There was massive news last week, almost undercovered, I thought, which was that our steel industry, which is in effect is part nationalised, has been hit by these massive 50% EU tariffs. Now, I learned over the weekend that some in the EU are nothing short of apologetic about the way that we've been caught up in the slipstream of their tit for tat with Donald Trump. So keep an eye out on whether those tariffs survive at those levels. There is some hope in government that there could be some movement pretty soon. And if there isn't, that's a pretty big black mark on our relationship with the EU. So keep an eye on that. Secondly, on this podcast, we don't often talk about the Greens, possibly not often enough, but today they're announcing, and this is interesting, that they've passed 100,000 members, which is a near 50% increase since Zach Polansky became leader. And I don't think the Tories' membership numbers are materially that much above that level. So I just think it's a thing that we're going to know.
But let's dive into the main story. And today's summit in Egypt is expected to last 2 hours. In some ways, it's really the photo call of all those world leaders, the being there aspect that is the biggest goal, not least because the AP wire is saying directly tackling the remaining issues of the conflict is unlikely at the gathering. But this is a UK-focused podcast, so let's focus on the fallout as it affects this end of things. The starting point for that just has to be the comments by Bridget Phillipson, Deputy Labour Leadership Contender and Education Secretary, and what she said to Trevor Phillips on Sky yesterday, to the fury of members of the US administration.
We have played a key role behind the scenes in shaping this. It's right that we do so because it's in all of our interest, including our own national interest, that we move to a lasting peace in the region.
Well, when you say behind the scenes, like what? I mean, it seems to everybody else in the world that this has been done by Trump and the Israelis and Hamas. What part did we play?
These are complex matters of diplomacy that we are involved in, but we do welcome and recognise the critical role that the American government played in moving us to this point.
Just hours later, the US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, reposted that clip of those comments from Bridget Phillipson and said, I assure you, she's delusional. She can thank Donald Trump any time just to set the record straight. So that has triggered a row as to whether Bridget Phillipson really overstepped by claiming that the UK was materially involved in this deal. Is she right to say that because we have some pull, Sam, with the Saudis and Qatar in the background, that you could say we are parties to it and supportive to the Americans in that, albeit minorly, and that Mike Huckabee is being a bit ungracious, which can happen? Or is she really so far kind of over the line of what she really should have claimed in terms of the UK's input, and remembering that it's never a great idea to touch the third rail of annoying the Trump administration unless you're very secure on what you want out of it? What did you make of it?
So interestingly, since yesterday's row, one of Donald Trump's most senior advisors, Steve Witkoff, has actually jumped onto social media to praise specifically and only the quote-unquote vital role of the UK in getting and coordinating efforts that have led us to today. And actually hat tip somebody that we're going to be talking about in depth later in this podcast, which is Jonathan Powell, saying he wants to recognise the incredible input and tireless efforts of him. She is right to say Britain has a role, right? It's just that in this diplomatic game, you have to acknowledge the Trump role first. The British role is particularly big in reconstruction. The World Bank estimates that reconstruction and recovery needs about £53 billion to sort out Gaza. And there's going to be a reconstruction conference. And I think the UK will do the heavy lifting in the next few days, unveiling a humanitarian aid package in Gaza. And Britain's also expected to play a role decommissioning weapons by Hamas and to help disarm the group, drawing on expertise gained in Northern Ireland. So there is a big and proper British role here. It's just you've got to play the game in the right order. But in truth, the diplomacy around all of this is much more tricky than that. Now, and I know you wanted to talk about the role of Tony Blair in all of this, who Mark Stone says is in Egypt, and in fact meeting Mahmoud Abbas's number two, Hussein el-Sheikh, today in Egypt. I want to hear your view on Blair's centrality. I did actually ask Keir Starmer about this on Thursday at a press conference when we were in India.
I'm less interested, to be perfectly frank, in discussions about personnel than I am in getting it implemented.
So that, to my ear, sounds like Starmer putting a bit of distance between himself and Blair. Number 10 to say not. Number 10, couldn't say whether Starmer would meet Blair today, but it's a possibility. So that's one thing to watch for. I saw the renowned diplomatic journalist Mark Urban in the Sunday Times saying that there was some resistance from Hamas to Blair playing a part on the reconstruction board, in so much as Hamas will have a say. Where do you think Blair sits in all of this?
Oddly enough, I think it kind of follows from what you were laying out there about the reaction to that clip of Bridget Phillipson. I think the key mistake she made, she's very experienced in domestic politics, she's not so experienced in the international realm, was you could certainly make the point, as you've reflected, that once this deal is really underway, assuming that today goes, everybody's fingers across there for the big hostage releases, etc., that then the UK will have a role going forward. That is true in the transitional arrangements in Gaza, which is where Tony Blair comes in as the first person there to be put into that kind of team and that arrangement, the first named person who's clearly done that, if you like, as a side deal with Donald Trump. I think what was a stretch and was a problem was to suggest that we had been involved in the deal up to this point, which I think contextually that did sound a bit like what Bridget Phillipson was suggesting, whether she meant to or not. So that's what got the blowback from the US, because frankly, it's not particularly true. We are there in the background, but we have not been really parties up front to the deal that comes to fruition today. So what happens afterwards? Yes, you're right. That's where we do have skin in the game, and we have it via Tony Blair in this transitional arrangement. He's been working on this for a long time. He has his own track to Donald Trump. Slightly odd parallel to foreign policy, foreign affairs there, in which we have our embassy in Washington and the Foreign Office who oversee the general negotiations. And then Tony Blair just turns up and goes to see Donald Trump, and he's very close to Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who has put the deal together for the Trump side. In terms of what the parties think of him, Tony Blair, very, very well seen in Israel. He told me in an interview only not yet a year ago, how time flies, that he'd been there. I can't remember the exact number of times, but it was like more than 200 times he'd been to Israel. So he's really seen as being sort of tight there with the Netanyahu leadership and understanding things from their perspective. Hamas, it doesn't, in a sense, matter what they think. To the formal version is that they won't be in government in this arrangement, but Hamas is the power on the ground in the Palestinian Authority, and so to an extent, it's good to be able to talk to proxies of Hamas. The reason they particularly don't like Tony Blair is from his time when he was an envoy in that quartet, if you remember, envoy to the Middle East. George Bush gave him that role after he left office. And some people in the region do think that that was a small factor in pushing Hamas towards its more extreme wings and those who were prepared to practice violence pretty much on a daily basis against Israel. So there's, if you like, there's a lot of prehistory here, as well as what's going to happen in the next few days.
That's absolutely fascinating. We will see how his role shakes out. I think the cameras will follow Tony Blair wherever he goes. Should we turn just briefly, because there's not a huge amount of time left, to China? I have to say, Anne, like I think sometimes there's no shame when Westminster loses its mind and engaged in a very angry shouting match in actually admitting that you're a bit lost on a story. And I have been until last night a bit lost on the story of the collapse of the China trial. And I've just gone right back because I watched Bridget Phillips and slightly uncomfortably trying to talk about the role of the government. And I just knew there was a lot that I didn't know. So I just going to take 1 minute to lay out, because the big question for me is, this big trial collapsed. What changed? Why did that happen? And let me try and explain why. And then you've got some brilliant stuff about what was going on inside government. As listeners will know, this is all about the collapse of a trial of two Brits accused of spying between December 2021 and February 2023. And I'm sorry, dates matter in this case. They were arrested in March 2023, and charges were brought last year in April 2024. So all of that happened when the Tories were in power. So that means that in April 2024, the CPS and its director, Stephen Parkinson, thought they had enough evidence to bring a prosecution. Fast forward to September the 15th this year, and the CPS said that they were dropping the charges because of lack of evidence. So the big question is, what changed? And by the way, Labour simply coming to power isn't an answer to that. Right. What changed is that the legal evidential hurdle in case law increased in the view of the CPS. Right. Why is that? In March this year, so March 2025, 6 Bulgarian nationals were found guilty of spying for Russia under the Official Secrets Act. That's the act that also the two alleged China spies, were charged under. And it was a Court of Appeal ruling, and the CPS determined that that ruling meant that the bar of the kind of testimony needed from government had to rise, and that because of the March this year ruling, they needed to go back to government to get government to say much more specifically that back when these guys were allegedly spying, China was an enemy. And it is the refusal of the government, it appears, to increase the amount of evidence in this case that is at the heart of the collapse. China, government sources will say China wasn't designated an enemy formally, publicly back in that period. There are statements from ministers to the contrary, and therefore they couldn't. The government machine determined that they couldn't do this. All of this was done outside of the control of ministers, and they say that Jonathan Powell didn't materially get involved with all of this. But that's the thing, where you hear ministers say on the record and on TV and radio, like Bridget Phillipson did yesterday, look, we didn't interfere with the evidence at all. That's because the request of the CPS was to give them something more, and the government, I think we're talking about deputy national security advisors and people at that level, determined that they wouldn't meet the higher evidential bar set by this Court of Appeal ruling, in which the CPS decided needed for the first time you to say that China was an enemy in court. And that's the thing that didn't happen, that meant the case collapsed. So that is what I understand is going on. It all comes back to a change in the threshold. So My question to you, Anne, is talking to everybody that you know in your incredible contacts book, why do you think the government didn't do what the CPS wanted? Because they must have thought it was a reasonable request, right?
It depends whether they fundamentally were happy for the trial to go ahead or whether they don't. So I think what you lay out very well there is that point about the evidential bar and how you use that designation about what it takes to be seen to be acting in a hostile way to the interests of the UK. And I put it like that because I think we're falling for a bit of a red herring here. We don't need to designate someone an enemy to take them to court for spying. I mean, I've got a bit of a background about writing about espionage and intelligence, and then also what it takes to make a successful prosecution. So I think the bigger issue here, Sam, is what did Number 10 and what did officials at the top of the hierarchy close to the Prime Minister kind of make of this case? Because what they could have simply said was, well, it's over to you at the CPS. We'll give you every help that we can. We'll give you these witnesses. Oh, by the way, we don't want to use this enemy designation. I think it's pretty obvious why that is. There is a desire to have a much more textured relationship in the way that we deal with China, and therefore also the way that we talk about China. This is something, if you speak to people in the operation that deals with China in the Foreign Office and other parts of government, they're very aware of. They speak, I wouldn't say candidly about, but they acknowledge that there are reasons if you're trying to get big trade deals out of China why you don't keep getting around, calling them the enemy. But at the same time, and I think this is what has really irked Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker in Parliament, and Playbook scooped the story that he was furious and determined to have this discussed in Parliament a little while ago. That's now coming back, as it appears there really will be. We're going to have urgent questions in the Commons and whatever follows from that, and trying to drag people more in front of Parliament to explain themselves, is did they really need to go down this route of saying, well, a certain form of words has changed in the Bulgarian case, the group of Bulgarians who were spying for the Russians for the GRU, part of the Russian spy network, or actually, could you just, in a sense, have gone and done it and said they were plainly hostile to the interests of the UK? They may have not acted unknowingly. We should say that they insist that they are innocent. But quite often, cases like that have been heard. One was heard in Germany very recently. The people say, well, I didn't know what I was doing, or it was all, I thought that this was not in any sense sensitive, the information I was giving. There are lots of defences, but you could have simply said, well, let the jury decide then whether it hits the evidential bar for being hostile to the interests of the UK. To that extent, I'm a little suspicious about laying it all on the CPS.
There's a lot of heat on Jonathan Powell for all of this. And isn't Jonathan Powell just fulfilling and executing the policy instructions of the Prime Minister? Is the person not really under fire here, Keir Starmer? And to lay it on Jonathan Powell for following presumably a steer that the Prime Minister gave him, perhaps even a little unfair on him?
My guess is that Jonathan Powell is steering the Prime Minister rather than the other way around, in the sense that the Prime Minister doesn't have a deep bench of experience on China. He, with his Chancellor Rachel Reeves, they know that they want to keep China on board. They know there's that big visit. You've just been in India, Sam. You know how important these big visits are in terms of, you can imagine the sort of business opportunities there at lots of areas, which we have time to talk about now, but where the UK feels it really does need China specifically for investment. But Jonathan Powell came in as National Security Advisor, and to me, this is the big question about his role, which will emerge. Was he acting as National Security Advisor? Lots of previous holders of his office seem to be quite critical of him on that score. Or was it essentially as a kind of diplomat and warmer-upper in the relationship with China, which is a role in which I can much more easily see Jonathan Powell. That's what he's done a lot in the past. He's an agreement maker. He tends, if you like, to trade things away in order to get, as he would see it, progress. Certainly the Good Friday Agreement was a positive example he was involved in. But there are a lot of people saying, well, isn't the job of National Security Advisor security?
Absolutely fascinating. Jonathan Powell steers the Prime Minister. By the way, Powell wasn't on the India trip. Quite interestingly, I thought, as a senior foreign policy figure. Oh, it's Morgan McSweeney, as it happens. Right, we need to steer each other into port because our 20 minutes is up. Very excited. We've got great stuff coming up all this week, not least the polling verdict on the conference season tomorrow, and yet more besides on Wednesday. So I can't wait to see you again tomorrow.
See you in the morning.